Back in the day, dinner wasn't just about eating. It was about making the most of what you had. These meals were simple, filling, and made to last. They came from hard work, long days, and tight budgets. In this video, we're looking at 25 classic working man's dinners that used to be common in American kitchens, but over time, quietly disappeared. Number 1, ham hocks and cabbage. This dish came straight from the heart of homes where work was hard, budgets were thin, and every scrap mattered. Ham hocks weren't something you showed off with, but if you knew how to cook them, they became a meal that stuck with you. They were bony, fatty, and full of that deep, smoky pork flavor that made a pot of cabbage taste like something special. You'd toss the hocks into a big stock pot with chopped cabbage, onions if you had them, maybe a clove of garlic or two. Then, you'd add just enough water to cover, bring it to a boil, and let it simmer slow all afternoon. No one hovered over it. It did its thing while folks came home, kicked off muddy boots, and thawed out from the cold. The smell alone, rich, earthy, slightly sweet, was enough to make you forget the long day. The fat from the hocks melted down into the broth, turning it silky and thick. The cabbage got soft and flavorful, soaking up all that goodness. If you were lucky, someone baked bread, and if not, you dipped a spoon straight into the bowl. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted, and when there were leftovers, they were even better the next day, reheated in a pot with maybe a can of beans tossed in to bulk it up. This was the kind of meal you made when there wasn't much left in the fridge, but you still wanted something warm and filling. It was honest food, built to feed bodies that worked hard, built to last more than a night. And in a time when folks didn't always know what tomorrow would bring, that pot of ham hocks and cabbage on the back burner meant everything was going to be all right, at least for tonight. Number 2, braised rabbit. Back when meat was a luxury and grocery stores weren't on every corner, dinners sometimes came hopping right through your backyard. Rabbits were lean, quick to catch if you had the know-how, and most importantly, they were free. In working-class homes, especially out in the country, braised rabbit was a quiet staple. It wasn't bragged about, but it got the job done, and it did so with flavor. The preparation was simple but full of care. Once caught, cleaned, and sectioned, the rabbit pieces were quickly seared in a cast iron pan to lock in the flavor. Then came the vegetables, whatever you had on hand. Most often it was rough-cut carrots, potatoes, onions, maybe some celery or parsnips. These were tossed in with the rabbit, along with a splash of broth or water, and sometimes a sprig of rosemary or thyme if the garden was kind that season. Then the lid went on, and everything simmered low for hours. By the time it was ready, the meat was tender enough to fall off the bone with just a fork. The broth was thick and full of depth, having soaked up all the earthy notes from the roots and meat. It was a meal that filled you up without weighing you down. And in homes where the kids outnumbered the meat on the plate, the trick was always to stretch it with a bit more potato or bread. It wasn't just food, it was proof that with a little skill and a lot of patience, you could turn the most basic ingredients into something soulful. Braised rabbit might have disappeared from our kitchens, but for those who remember the taste, it's hard to forget how something so simple could feel so complete. Number 3, pickled pig's feet. You either grew up loving these or grew up watching someone else eat them with a mix of awe and confusion. Pickled pig's feet were one of those bold dishes that made no apologies. They were sour, chewy, full of texture, and full of history. These weren't a weekly dinner item, but when they appeared on the table or bar counter, you knew somebody had been thinking ahead. The process was straightforward. The pig's feet were cleaned, boiled until tender, and then soaked in a brine made from vinegar, garlic, spices, and sometimes hot pepper. They sat in glass jars for days, sometimes weeks, absorbing every bit of that tangy, punchy flavor. By the time they were ready, they weren't just food, they were an experience. You'd pull them out cold or at room temp, slice them, and usually serve them with something simple like boiled potatoes or a hunk of bread to cut through the acidity. No one pretended this was gourmet, but it was protein-rich, affordable, and satisfying in a way that made you feel like you'd earned it. In bars, they were a salty snack. In kitchens, they were part of a quiet celebration, of getting by, of making the most out of every part of the animal, of eating with pride even when the choices were slim. These days, most folks turn their nose up at pickled pig's feet, but for working families who knew how to stretch a dollar, this dish held value way beyond taste. It was a symbol of not letting anything go to waste. of tough times met with tougher traditions. And whether you loved them or just respected them, pickled pig's feet were a piece of culinary grit that earned their place in food history. Number 4, cold meatloaf sandwiches. Here's the truth. Sometimes the best part of dinner is the next day's lunch. And that was especially true when meatloaf was on the menu. Leftovers weren't just leftovers. They were the plan all along. A slab of cold meatloaf, firmed up from a night in the fridge, slapped between 2 slices of white bread with a squeeze of mustard, that was lunch. That was gold. These sandwiches didn't need to be heated up. In fact, part of the charm was the chill. The flavors had settled overnight. The texture was just right. Not crumbly, not soggy, just solid and satisfying. Meatloaf itself was already a working man's classic. Ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs or oats, mixed with egg and seasoning, then baked with a slick layer of ketchup or tomato sauce on top. But that next day sandwich, eaten at the kitchen table or straight from a lunch pail at a construction site, hit different. It was sturdy, portable, mess-free. No fork, no microwave, just grab and go. Some folks added a slice of onion or a piece of lettuce if they had it, maybe a pickle on the side. But even plain, it worked. It was honest food, dependable, tasty without being fussy. And the best part? You didn't need to be hungry to enjoy it. You could just want something that reminded you of home, of mom packing your lunch, or dad coming in from work with grease-stained hands and a big appetite. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were the definition of blue-collar comfort. Easy to make, easy to eat, and somehow better than hot meatloaf ever was. Try it once, and you'll understand why nobody ever complained when meatloaf was on the menu. Number 5, chicken livers and rice. This one was loud from the start, the sizzle of chicken livers hitting a hot pan, the scent of onions and peppers filling the air. It smelled like dinner and sounded like someone knew what they were doing. Chicken livers weren't everyone's favorite, but for families who needed meals to be cheap, quick, and full of nutrients, they were a no-brainer. Loaded with iron and protein, they cost next to nothing at the store because most folks overlooked them. But in the hands of someone who knew how to cook, they turned into something memorable. The basic recipe didn't ask for much. You diced up onions and bell peppers, whatever color you had, maybe some garlic too, and tossed them into a skillet with a splash of oil. When they softened up, in went the livers, trimmed and rinsed. A quick sear gave them color, then everything cooked down together until the edges browned and the inside stayed just barely pink. Over a big scoop of rice, it became a meal that could hold its own. Some families spiced it up with hot sauce or cayenne. Others added a splash of soy or Worcestershire to deepen the flavor. Whatever worked, it was rich but not heavy, filling but not overwhelming. And the best part, you could pull it off with just one burner and one skillet. Ideal for small kitchens, busy nights, or when the power bill was looming. Leftovers were rare, but if you had any, they packed great for lunch. Chicken livers and rice weren't about impressing anyone. They were about feeding people with what you had, about using what others threw away, and about proving once again that real flavor lives in the most unexpected places. Number 6, stuffed bell peppers. Stuffed bell peppers were one of those dinners that looked fancy, but were all about practicality. With just 1 pound of ground beef, some cooked rice, and a few colorful peppers, you could stretch your ingredients to feed a family. The peppers themselves acted like little edible bowls, holding in a warm, seasoned mix of meat and rice, maybe with a spoonful of tomato paste or a sprinkle of herbs to punch up the flavor. You'd brown the beef, mix it with the rice, toss in whatever you had on hand, diced onions, leftover vegetables, even shredded cheese if you were lucky, and stuff it all into the peppers. A quick bake in the oven brought everything together, bubbling and steamy. Sometimes you'd pour a thin tomato sauce or just water with seasoning over the top to keep things moist. It was easy to double or triple the recipe when mouths were many and the budget was thin. These were more than just meals. They were strategies. You could make them ahead, freeze them, or heat up the leftovers the next day, and they were still just as good. Filling, flexible, and surprisingly presentable, they were a hardworking dinner that always delivered. Number 7, Oxtail Stew. Oxtail stew might sound like a luxury now, but back then, it was what you made when nothing else was left in the butcher's case. Oxtail was bony, fatty, and overlooked, but folks who knew how to work a stove knew it was pure gold if you gave it time. You'd start by browning the oxtail pieces in a big, heavy pot until they got that deep, seared crust. Then you'd add chopped onions, carrots, and maybe a few cloves of garlic if you had them. Pour in some broth or just water. Toss in a handful of barley and let it all simmer low and slow for hours. The magic was in the weight. Over time, the meat would pull away from the bone and the fat would melt into the broth, giving it a silky, rich texture. The marrow inside those bones added even more depth, making this more than just soup. It was a full, stick-to-your-ribs meal in one bowl. With a slice of crusty bread or just a spoon, you were set. It was hot, hearty, and a quiet reminder that sometimes the cheapest cuts gave you the richest meals as long as you were patient. Number 8, breaded veal cutlet. These cutlets were the kind of meal that made you feel like it was payday, even if the wallet said otherwise. Thin slices of veal dipped in flour, then egg, then breadcrumbs, sizzled in a hot skillet until golden brown and crisp on the outside, but tender inside. There wasn't much to them, but that's what made them shine. The breading picked up the seasoning beautifully, and the thinness meant they cooked fast. Families loved these because they felt like restaurant food, special even if they came from the discount bin at the butcher's. Paired with mashed potatoes, whether from a box or boiled and whipped from scratch, and maybe a spoonful of gravy if you could spare the drippings, this meal was all about comfort. Sometimes there were green beans or frozen peas on the side, sometimes just a slice of white bread to sop up the crumbs. You didn't need a lot to make this one work, and that's why it was a favorite. Fast, crispy, and satisfying, it was perfect for weeknights when you were tired but still wanted dinner to feel like something worth sitting down for. It was the kind of food that lifted spirits without draining your pockets. Number 9, ground beef casserole. Call it what you want. Cowboy casserole, pantry bake, or just that thing mom makes with crackers on top. This ground beef casserole was a lifesaver. You'd brown a pound of ground beef, maybe with chopped onions or bell peppers if you had them, and then toss in a can of corn, some tomato sauce, or even cream of mushroom soup depending on what was in the cupboard. Everything got mixed together in a big bowl and poured into a baking dish, but the real joy came from the topping. Crushed saltines, Ritz crackers, or even leftover cornbread crumbs got sprinkled on top for that golden, crispy crunch. Some folks added cheese under the crust. Others stirred in cooked pasta or rice to make it go even further. It was never the same twice, and that was the beauty of it. You worked with what you had, and it always turned out okay. It baked up hot and bubbling, smelling like comfort the second you opened the oven. Served with a spoon straight from the pan, this casserole fed a full table without needing much at all. It was the king of quick fixes, filling, forgiving, and always welcome. Number 10, creamed tuna on egg noodles. If you grew up in a house where payday came with a sigh of relief, you probably remember creamed tuna on egg noodles. It was soft, mild, and hit the spot in a way only a hot bowl of noodles and sauce can. You'd start with a simple white sauce, melt some butter, stir in flour, then slowly add milk until it turned smooth and creamy. Into that went a can of tuna, drained and flaked, and maybe some frozen peas for color and a touch of sweetness. Season with salt, pepper, and garlic powder if you had it. Meanwhile, boil up some wide egg noodles until just tender, then mix it all together. The sauce clung to every ribbon of pasta, turning basic pantry staples into something comforting. Kids didn't argue with it, and adults appreciated that it could be made in 20 minutes flat. It wasn't a showstopper, but it was dependable. The kind of meal that got you through the week without complaints. If there were leftovers, they held up well too, reheated with a splash of milk. It was gentle food for tough times, and it stuck with you in all the right ways. Number 11, boiled dinner. Boiled dinner wasn't glamorous, but it filled your plate and your stomach, like few other meals could. It started with corned beef, the kind that came in big, briny slabs. You'd drop it into the biggest pot you had and cover it with water, letting it simmer for hours until the meat turned tender. Then, one by one, came the vegetables. Whole potatoes, skin on. Big chunks of cabbage, carrots peeled and chopped, all tossed into the same bubbling pot, soaking up that salty, savory broth. It smelled like Sunday and payday rolled into one, no side dishes needed. You just scoop everything out, plate by plate, sometimes with a spoonful of mustard for the meat. It was a full meal in a single pot, no fuss, no fancy prep, and best of all, the leftovers were gold. Sandwiches made from the meat, hash from the potatoes, and soup from the rest of the broth. It was a working man's feast, cooked low and slow and made to stretch. Whether you were in New England or a Midwest factory town, this meal had roots that ran deep. It wasn't special occasion food, but somehow, it still felt like one. Number 12, Salisbury Steak. Salisbury steak was the kind of dish that made you feel like you were eating something way fancier than you actually were. It started with ground beef, mixed with breadcrumbs, an egg, salt, pepper, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire if someone had splurged at the store. You shaped that mixture into oval patties, seared them in a skillet until brown and crusted, then set them aside while you built the gravy. The real magic was in the mushrooms, sliced and sautéed with onions, then a bit of flour to soak up all the drippings. You added broth or water, stirring until it bubbled and thickened into a silky gravy. The patties went back in, simmering until every bite was soaked with flavor. Served with mashed potatoes and maybe a scoop of canned green beans, this was as close to steak night as many families got. It wasn't just food, it was comfort. The next day's leftovers went between 2 slices of bread with extra gravy spread like mayo, making one heck of a sandwich. Hot, savory, and satisfying, Salisbury steak brought the diner experience home without the diner price tag. Number 13, pork neck bones and gravy. If you've never had pork neck bones slow-cooked in gravy, you're missing out on one of the South's best-kept secrets. These bony cuts were dirt cheap, sold in big packs, and packed with flavor when cooked right. You'd start by browning the neck bones in hot oil until the fat got crispy and the meat picked up color. Then came the chopped onions, cooked right into the drippings to soak up all that flavor. Add water or broth, lower the heat, and let it simmer for hours. The meat would start to fall off the bone, the liquid thickened into a rich, meaty gravy, and suddenly you had something special. Some folks added flour to help the gravy along. Others just let it cook down naturally. Either way, when it was ready, you poured it over a mountain of fluffy white rice. Add a biscuit or a slice of white bread to mop up the sauce, maybe some greens or canned corn, and you had dinner. This wasn't just a meal, it was a memory. Steamy, savory, and built from scraps that nobody else wanted but everybody loved when done right. Number 14, Oatmeal Meatloaf. Meatloaf was already a budget-friendly meal, but when breadcrumbs were running low, oatmeal stepped in like a quiet hero. Dry oats helped bind everything together. Ground beef, egg, a splash of milk, and a few basic seasonings. Onion, salt, pepper, maybe a squirt of ketchup. You'd mix it all up and pack it into a loaf pan, then top it with a thick layer of ketchup that caramelized in the oven. The oats soaked up the juices, keeping the loaf moist and hearty without falling apart. It sliced clean, held its shape, and filled the plate. You didn't need anything fancy to go with it, just a scoop of instant mashed potatoes, maybe some canned green beans or frozen corn. Leftovers were even better the next day, served cold, pan-fried, or stuffed into sandwiches. This wasn't just meatloaf, it was survival meatloaf. Simple, reliable, and just plain good. Number 15, Beef Heart Stew. Beef heart was not a show-off cut, but it was lean, full of flavor, and dirt cheap. If you had the time and knew what you were doing, it became one of the richest, most filling stews you could make. You had to trim it first, slicing off the fat and connective tissue, then cutting it into small chunks. Brown those in a heavy pot with oil, then add onions, carrots, maybe some garlic. Cover it all with broth or water and let it go low and slow. Some added bay leaves or a splash of vinegar to help break it down. After a few hours, the heart turned tender and the broth deepened in flavor. Served over rice, mashed potatoes, or just with crusty bread, it filled your belly and gave you energy for the day. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't for the squeamish, but it was real food for real folks. And once you tasted it done right, you realized how much you'd been missing out on. It was a tough cut turned tender with time, and that felt like a win every single time. Number 16, Smothered Pork Chops. This was comfort food at its finest. You'd start with thick-cut pork chops, usually bone-in, and give them a good sear in a hot skillet. The smell alone was enough to call the family into the kitchen. After the chops had a nice golden crust, they were pulled from the pan and set aside. Into the drippings went sliced onions. Lots of them. Sometimes garlic if you had it, and maybe a little bell pepper. Then came the flour, stirred until it soaked up all that meaty goodness, followed by water or broth to loosen everything into a rich brown gravy. The pork chops went back in, tucked under that gravy, and simmered until fork tender. You could eat it over white rice, scoop it with mashed potatoes, or just sop it all up with a slice of soft white bread. It wasn't a quick meal, but it was one that made everyone quiet at the table. The gravy thickened just right, the chops were juicy, and every bite tasted like it belonged in a family recipe book. It didn't need fancy plating. This was the kind of dinner that filled your belly and your heart at the same time. Number 17, canned tamale pie. Tamale pie didn't come from a gourmet cookbook. It came from the pantry, the kind of meal you threw together on a weeknight with what was already sitting on the shelf. You started with a pound of ground beef, browned in a skillet with chopped onions and whatever spices you had, chili powder, cumin, maybe some paprika. Then you'd dump in a can of corn, a can of diced tomatoes or tomato sauce, and maybe even some beans if you had them. All that got stirred together until it was thick, hearty, and bubbling. Then came the cornbread, usually from a box mix, stirred up quick with an egg and some milk, poured right over the beef mixture in a casserole dish like a golden blanket. Sometimes people mixed cheese into the batter or sprinkled it on top. Then it baked until the cornbread puffed up, the edges browned, and the whole thing smelled like dinner done right. You scooped it out in big spoonfuls, each one packed with meat, corn, and fluffy cornbread. It was Tex-Mex without the effort. And the best part? It tasted even better the next day. Number 18, lazy cabbage roll casserole. This was the shortcut dinner for folks who didn't have time to roll cabbage leaves all afternoon. But even without the fuss, it brought all the same cozy, tangy, meaty flavor that made traditional cabbage rolls so special. You started by browning ground beef with chopped onions and maybe some garlic. Then, you'd stir in cooked rice, salt, pepper, and tomato sauce until it formed that familiar, savory filling. Instead of stuffing and rolling, you chopped up a head of cabbage and layered it with the meat and rice mix in a baking dish. Tomato sauce or diced tomatoes got poured over everything, then it all went into the oven and baked until the cabbage was tender and the whole dish was bubbling and slightly caramelized on the edges. Some people topped it with a little cheese or a splash of vinegar before serving, just to brighten it up. It might not have looked fancy, but it was hearty, simple, and fed a whole family with ease. The leftovers were even better the next day, tasting like something your grandma might have made, if she had a little less time and a whole lot of mouths to feed. Number 19, macaroni and tomatoes with bacon grease. This one came from the bottom of the pantry and the back of the fridge. Elbow macaroni, a can of tomatoes, and a spoonful of saved bacon grease were all it took to pull together a smoky, tangy, surprisingly satisfying dinner. You boiled the macaroni just until it was soft, then drained it and tossed it straight into a hot skillet where a little bacon grease had already started to sizzle. That leftover grease, something every old-school kitchen kept in a jar, coated the pasta with salty, smoky flavor. Then you added in the canned tomatoes, juice and all, and let it simmer until it thickened just a bit and soaked into the noodles. A pinch of sugar could take the edge off the acidity, and a little salt and pepper brought it all home. It was a no-fuss dish that filled the plate and didn't cost much. There might not have been any meat in it, but it didn't need it. That bacon flavor did all the heavy lifting. It was perfect for nights when groceries were low, time was short, and dinner still had to happen. One skillet, one can, one memory. Number 20, chicken paprikash. Straight out of Eastern European tradition, chicken paprikash made its way into American kitchens because it was cheap, filling, and unforgettable. It started with bone-in chicken pieces, legs and thighs usually, seared until golden. Onions came next, cooked down until they were soft and sweet. Then, the real magic. Paprika, not a little sprinkle, a big handful. Sweet Hungarian paprika turned the whole dish deep red and filled the kitchen with an earthy aroma. Add a bit of flour to thicken it up, then pour in water or broth, and let the chicken simmer until it was fall-apart tender. Just before serving, a scoop of sour cream stirred into the pot made the sauce rich and velvety. The whole thing got ladled over egg noodles, soft and buttery, ready to soak up every drop. Some people added a pinch of cayenne, others didn't. But either way, it was bold, warm, and packed with flavor. This was the kind of meal that made you forget it came from scraps. It tasted like tradition, even if you made it on a Wednesday night with what you had on hand. Number 21, city chicken, mock chicken legs. This dish was a little food magic. No actual chicken involved, yet it looked just like a drumstick when it hit the plate. In reality, it was usually cubes of pork or veal, skewered tightly onto wooden sticks and shaped to resemble a leg. You dip each one in egg, roll it in breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, and then fry it until the outside was golden and crispy. Sometimes folks would sear them in a pan first and then finish them off in the oven, covered in foil to keep everything juicy. The result was tender, savory meat inside a crunchy coating, and if you served it up with mashed potatoes and a ladle of gravy, nobody asked what it was. They just dug in. It was popular in old factory towns where pork was cheaper than poultry, and butchers got creative. You'd find them in school cafeterias, working-class kitchens, and potlucks, where they always disappeared fast. It was a meal that felt like a treat, even though it was born out of frugality, and it made kids smile. After all, food on a stick always tastes better, doesn't it? That's just one of the many ways people stretched $1 and still made something delicious. Number 22, hamburger gravy on mashed potatoes. There's something incredibly satisfying about a plate of hot mashed potatoes swimming in rich, meaty gravy. And when payday was still a few days off, hamburger gravy made sure dinner didn't disappoint. You started with ground beef. Just 1 pound could feed a small army. Browned up in a skillet with a bit of chopped onion or garlic if you had it, the meat got pushed to one side, and then came the flour. Stirred right into the drippings, the flour soaked up every bit of flavor. Then, you slowly poured in milk or water, whisking until it thickened into a creamy, savory gravy. Once everything was combined, the gravy clung to every bit of meat, turning simple ground beef into something warm and hearty. Meanwhile, you had mashed potatoes, either fresh or from a box, ready to go. Ladle that hot gravy right on top, and dinner was served. Frozen peas or canned green beans were the usual side, but honestly, the main dish was enough on its own. It was quick, filling, and didn't cost much. For a lot of folks, it was the kind of meal that reminded them of growing up, and somehow, it never stopped tasting like home. Number 23, tuna noodle ring mold. The 1950s were all about presentation, and nothing said dinner party quite like a ring mold. Enter the tuna noodle ring, a creamy, quirky casserole shaped into a circle, baked to golden perfection, and proudly flipped onto a plate like it was the star of the show. You made it by cooking egg noodles until just tender, then folding them into a rich, velvety mixture of canned tuna, mayonnaise, or cream of mushroom soup, peas, a touch of black pepper, and maybe a dash of lemon juice. The whole mixture went into a greased ring mold, pressed in tightly so it held its shape. Into the oven it went, baked until it was just firm enough to keep form. Then came the dramatic moment, the flip. It landed on a platter with a soft thud, steaming and slightly ridiculous, often dusted with a little paprika for flair. When you sliced it, it held together beautifully, and each serving was creamy, salty, and full of nostalgic flavor. It might seem odd today, but back then, this was creative cooking. It took humble ingredients and made them feel a little special, a little fancy, and it fed the whole family with leftovers to spare. Number 24, potato soup with crackers and butter. When the fridge was nearly empty and grocery money was still a few days away, potato soup was the quiet hero of the dinner table. It started with the basics, just peeled and chopped potatoes, maybe an onion if you had one, and water. Boiled until soft, the potatoes were then mashed right in the pot or left chunky, depending on how hearty you wanted it. A splash of milk, a knob of butter, salt, and pepper turned that pot into something creamy and comforting. It was the kind of meal you could stretch, thicken, or thin out, depending on how many mouths you needed to feed. Crushed saltine crackers went right on top, softening slightly in the steam, while a pat of butter melted into a golden pool in the center. It wasn't fancy, but it filled the belly, warmed you up, and made you feel just a little better when times were tough. Sometimes people added cheese if they had any, or bacon bits if leftovers allowed, but even plain, it hit the spot. It was Depression-era cooking at its best. Simple, honest, and endlessly adaptable. And it's the kind of thing you don't forget, because it showed up when you needed it most. Number 25, bologna boats. You don't have to be fancy to make something fun, and bologna boats proved it. These weird little wonders started with thick slices of bologna laid flat on a baking sheet. As they baked, the edges curled up like little edible bowls, forming the perfect pocket for a scoop of shredded cheese. Sometimes it was cheddar, other times mozzarella, or even American slices torn into bits. Whatever you had. On top of the cheese went crushed crackers, maybe saltines or Ritz for a bit of crunch. The tray went into the oven just long enough for the cheese to melt, the edges to crisp, and the whole thing to come together into a salty, greasy, cheesy bite of joy. Some folks got creative, adding mustard or ketchup, or even a spoonful of leftover mashed potatoes or chili as filling. No two boats were ever the same. It was a quick dinner, a snack, or a midnight bite that felt both ridiculous and perfect at the same time. Served with coleslaw, canned veggies, or eaten 3 at a time with a cold drink. Bologna boats weren't about nutrition. They were about using what you had and making something that made people smile.